of young Canadian women say they're putting off kids because they can't afford them. But Mark Carney wants 100 million people, not for families, for the machine. No homes, no hope, and no future. Just growth at any cost. Not to build Canada, but to change it.
I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is the Candice Malcolm Show. We have a great episode for you today. So we wanted to give you a guide to what you should be looking for on election night. It all comes down to a few key swing ridings. We've been highlighting them throughout the campaign in our series Juno polls with our in-house pollster, David Murray. And so we're going to spend some time sort of nerding out on the data and talking about which seats, as the polls close on Monday evening, as the results come in, where should you be watching? What specific ridings do the Conservatives need to win in order to get their minority or even majority government? And which ones do they have to protect and hold on to prevent Mark Carney from winning this election? So we're going to go through it all. It's going to be a great episode. Very pleased. So we have David Murray, our in-house pollster from One Persuasion. Also pleased to be joined by Wyatt Claypool. I invited to join this call because he is so insightful. He is a political commentator and the founder of the National Telegraph. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us today.
Good to be with you.
Thanks for having me on.
Okay, so I want to start with Fake News Friday. It's my favorite segment on the Candice Malcolm Show. And this one just really stood out because in the last few days before an election, this is sort of how the media get away with tipping the scale, with really trying to make it so that the Liberals will flat out win the election. This is the kind of thing that they do. They plan a fake story and they all ran with it. So here we had the Globe and Mail come up with this story. Poilievre may lose his Ottawa area riding as Liberals poised to sweep the region. The Toronto Star followed suit, wrote a similar kind of story. Conservatives pour resources into Pierre Poilievre's riding amid fears of a tight race. And finally, Post Media, Ottawa Citizen, they all just basically wrote the same story. Pierre Poilievre in a horse race in Carleton as gap with Liberal candidate tightens. I think this story is total nonsense, planted in order to basically make Conservative voters feel like they have no hope. Like if Poilievre is losing his own riding in rural Ottawa, then the election's over. We might as well not even go out to vote on Monday. I think it's not true at all. And I think that, well, the reason that I wanted to bring this up, I'll go to you first, Wyatt. Help me debunk this story. Is this true? Do you think Pierre Poilievre is in risk of losing his own riding?
Well, whenever someone makes a big claim like this, the first thing you should go to is see if the sources are actually public or they're anonymous. And this story is using anonymous sources from the Progressive Conservative Party of Ontario, and it shouldn't be surprising at this point that the PC party does not like the CPC and will do literally anything in order to undermine Pierre Poilievre. When it said that there was 2 anonymous sources that were quoted from the Progressive Conservative Party, my immediate reaction was, what is it, Corey Tenaike and his friend Corey Tenaike, who are telling them that Poilievre's totally going to lose. This is like if in the Alberta provincial election, the UCP was going to lose Chestermere Strathmore. It's just obviously untrue. Yeah, you could go down a suburban road in Carleton and find a bunch of people who don't like Pierre Poilievre. Do you think people who live on acreages in the more rural areas in the small towns near or in Carleton, that they're going to be voting Liberal, or for Bruce Fanjoy, a man who fits in better to a Victoria Council meeting than he does to a Carleton federal election? Is just obviously not true. And in fact, Mark Carney has a better chance of losing Nepean than Poilievre has of losing Carleton.
Interesting. Well, you were campaigning in the region I believe in Pierre Poilievre's riding. Is that right, Wyatt?
I wasn't in Poilievre's riding. I was in the riding that Mark Carney is running in of Nepean. I was in Ottawa West Nepean, and I was in Canada that's right next to Carleton. The Liberals, in fact, are actually scared Mark Carney could lose, and he's poaching volunteers from Canada and Ottawa West Nepean. And I know this because I was on the ground, and every day you would be driving around or door knocking, you couldn't find any Liberal volunteers. And in fact, the Conservative candidates were saying that Carney's people have been sucking those volunteers into Nepean to the point where people like Anita Vandenbelt in Ottawa West Nepean and Jenna Sudds in Canada are only going around with about 10 volunteers a day, which is pretty bad considering their opponents have about 2 to 3 times the volunteer base that they do.
Wow, interesting. Well, David, I want to ask you the question because one of the interesting things that happened in this campaign, I don't know how it happened. To me, this is kind of like voter shenanigans or election interference in some way. But there's about 200 people running as independent candidates in Pierre Poilievre's riding. If you look at the ballot, it is an absurd joke. Like this to me makes Canada just seem like an unserious country. Could that have any impact on the election? And from polls and numbers that you've seen in this campaign, is Poilievre in any risk of losing his own seat?
Poilievre is absolutely not in a risk of losing his seat of Carleton. He has held this seat since 2004. He held this through the Justin Trudeau majority. There's no way that this is going red whatsoever. As for the ballot, this is what's called the longest ballot initiative. It is effectively a stunt to try to promote electoral reform. It more just upsets people, and it's more of just like a hassle as well for election poll workers and voters that are actually going to be filling out those ballots. They're not helping their cause at all.
It's frustrating to me when I look at it. I just think it's silly and it makes Canada seem unserious. So just for reference, in 2021, Pierre Poilievre won the election with more than 50% of the vote, 51.86% to the Liberals' 31%. So I think that's a bit of wish casting on behalf of the legacy media. And like I said, I think it's strategic. They're trying to discourage conservative voters and getting them to stay at home. Okay, next thing I want to talk about with you gentlemen is, so I had David Murray on the show earlier this week. We talked about our final poll, Juno poll. We have a tie, a dead heat. The poll was in the field on Tuesday. So on Tuesday, it was a dead heat. 39 for the Liberals, 39 for the Conservatives. One thing that we've done throughout this campaign is something we call the neighbor poll. And in our neighbor poll, we have consistently shown that the Conservatives are ahead. When you ask Canadians who their neighbors are voting for, they might be less shy to tell you that it is the Conservatives. That's who the signs are showing. That's signs in the neighborhood. They outnumber Conservatives. Well, David Coletto, who I consider one of the best, if not the best, pollsters in the country, has followed suit, and he's done his own neighbor poll in this election. And interestingly enough, he found a very similar result to what we found. He asked the exact same question we asked: who do you think your neighbors are voting for? And his poll found that 44% of people say Conservative to the Liberals. 40%. David, what do you think of Abacus News picking up on our neighbor poll and their results?
I think it's very smart. I think that the fact that there's certain blind spots that the ballot question can potentially have, it's good to have a more fulsome picture. And as mentioned, this has been a method that has been tried and tested down the United States and France and Germany as picking up trends. So it's a very interesting way to view the ballot. And it might even get away from some of the shy Tory syndrome that we know is quite prevalent within the polling industry, as we've seen around the world.
And what do you think, Wyatt?
One of the things that you have with the current Conservative coalition going into this election is that it's actually become far more minority, and it has always been rural, and it still is. So a poll question like this, or asking people, who do you think your neighbor is going to vote for, is also going to make up for those individuals who are less likely to pick up the phone or go online and answer a poll. It allows you to find the people who are likely to answer a poll and have them answered on other people's behalf. Or else what you're really going to do is get people who live in metropolitan areas and who are older being the most likely people to actually answer your poll. It's just natural that if you work a white-collar job, you are going to be more likely to take an online Leger poll or an IVR poll than a farmer driving his combine.
Mm-hmm. No, it's so true. And the fact that, I mean, we were talking about this in the last show as well, that there is a bias where people sometimes tell the pollsters what they think the pollster wants to hear. And so if the theme on the CBC is, we have to put our elbows up and support the Liberals to stop Donald Trump, then they might be inclined to tell a pollster that, even though their own intent might be to vote Conservative. I guess only time will tell. We'll find on election night whether there's something to our neighbor poll and it shows something different than what the rest of the country's pollsters have been showing. Okay, let's get to the ridings, because this is kind of the fun part when everyone, you pull out your spreadsheets and you go back and look at the numbers throughout the years and you figure out, what does it look like for Pierre Poilievre to win this election? What are the seats that he must win? Let's start east to west, because the polls will close first in Atlantic Canada. So David, if it's election night, we're watching the polls close, and we're looking at Atlantic Canada. What are the seats that you're looking at, and what are the ridings that Poilievre has to win?
So I'm looking first and foremost at rural Newfoundland, specifically Long Range Mountains and Central Newfoundland. I think those two ridings are actually going to be quite telling as to some of the dynamics that we're seeing throughout the entire region. Secondly, I'm going to be looking at South Shore St. Margaret's, just Rick Perkins. It's a very interesting dynamic given that the NDP has dropped out. Rick has been a very effective parliamentarian, so we'll get to see how his ground game and his base support, especially in the fisheries files, which he's been a very outspoken advocate for on the criminal justice side of that specifically. So we'll see how that actually translates.
Interesting. Okay. And why? What are you going to be looking for in Atlantic Canada?
Well, in Atlantic Canada, what people do need to watch out for is that the Conservatives don't need to win Atlantic Canada to be able to win the election. Sometimes it's actually kind of like how Americans react to different states going in the Democrat or Republican slot for their electoral college, and they think, oh my goodness, all is lost. It's like in Atlantic Canada, the Conservatives just need to be grabbing a little more than a third of the seats, and they're in business for the rest of the country. And now I even know people who are on the ground in Nova Scotia and in other Atlantic provinces where the media has also been deploying these stories about how longtime Conservative incumbents who won massive victories in 2021 could go down to defeat in this election. They not only have been working for the Conservatives on the ground, hitting doors, but they themselves are polling analysts, and they've been saying that's complete nonsense. Yes, you will see a little bit of suburban drift near two cities towards the Liberals, but in the deep rural areas or along the more bedroom communities of places like Halifax and St. John's and Fredericton, it's conservative. It's conservative because working class voters, especially union voters, have shifted towards Conservatives in maybe the same rate that many people who are retired and watch the legacy media at home have shifted towards the Liberals.
Hey, that's so interesting. And so do you have a number for how many seats you think the Conservatives need to win in Atlantic Canada? I believe we established that there are 7 going into this election. Do either of you think that there's a chance that they're going to pick up seats? Do they have to just hold those 7 seats? Or what are you thinking? I'll start with you, David.
It was actually my mistake yesterday because it's actually 8 are the incumbent seats. So
Okay.
I think that 8 is very probable. We could see up to 10 is what I would suggest.
Interesting. And do you have any thoughts on that one, Wyatt?
I think that what we saw with the fishermen protesting the Mark Carney event in Newfoundland, that probably does point to there being a lot of these rural Atlantic ridings where maybe the macro national trends don't pick up on them going Conservative, but the micro issues on the ground around fishing and around oil and gas in Newfoundland might end up actually having a lot of sort of off the table wins for the Conservatives that we didn't expect. This has happened in provincial elections leading up to this where the Conservatives in British Columbia end up winning a bunch of Surrey seats, and it's just because you can't pick up on the type of voters who are moving Conservative in the polling.
That's interesting. Yeah, there are distinct voters out there. Okay, let's move on to Quebec. I don't want to spend too much time on this region because Conservatives don't really do very well in Quebec. But David, why don't you walk us through what are the most important issues, maybe even not for the Conservatives, but just to watch out for? Like I know we talked earlier in the campaign about the Bloc surging and winning more seats, picking up more seats in suburban Montreal will really help the Conservatives in just keeping Mark Carney's number down. So talk to us about what are the most important ridings to watch in Quebec.
There's 2 in particular that jump off the page to me. The first is La Prairie at Tatacan. That's one of the actual key swing riding profiles that we did. And the reason for it is it's a natural step for both the Liberals and the Bloc Québécois, both in and out of the island of Montreal, and for a further expansion to the South Shore, which is where the Liberals will be seeking to expand their holdings. And then the second one is going to be Trois-Rivières. We have the former mayor running for the Conservatives, and this is going to be a very interesting race, specifically between the Bloc and the Conservatives.
Interesting. One of the ridings I keep hearing from people about is Mont Royal, which is a Montreal riding that basically it's a Liberal stronghold. The Conservatives have no business even being competitive in this area, except for the fact that there is a sizable Jewish community, and many believe that the Jewish community in Canada has flipped and that they will be voting Conservative in this riding. So why don't you talk to us a little bit about that dynamic and do you think that Conservatives actually have a chance to win this riding?
I wouldn't give them a big chance of winning Mount Royal. Naturally, it is a long-time default Liberal riding, but you are right that a significant portion of the Jewish community has gone from being default Liberal voters to now probably being default Conservative voters because of the Liberal and the NDP coalition's enabling of pro-Hamas protesters and the kind of soft way that they deal with Hamas in Gaza itself and the way they constantly condemn Israel in the United Nations. So I don't think that Neil Oberman is the favorite to win Mount Royal, but the fact that it's competitive is going to probably say things about how how ridings are going to play out in the Toronto area as well as the Ottawa area. Because when I was in Ottawa, West Nepean, we were in Jewish default Liberal ridings or poll areas where the Conservatives previously only won maybe 13% of the vote or 14% of the vote. And we were probably grabbing up every third door or so, which is pretty good. You know, maybe not everyone turns out, but that's kind of your litmus test in many of these ridings to see whether or not they can actually be flipped. Go to the Liberal sections of a Liberal riding and see if it's more of a tight fight or if it's still stayed with a massive gap between the Liberal vote and the Conservative vote.
That's interesting. And so, do you have any other thoughts or anything else that you're looking at specifically in Quebec?
David is going to be way better at explaining Quebec than I am, but if I am to simplify it for people like myself on what's going on in Quebec, is that right now it's just, can the Bloc prevent the Liberals from breaking out of the island of Montreal? If that happens, like in Atlantic Canada, if the Conservatives can gain a couple seats and defend their incumbents, then the Liberals are, again, not actually adding towards their ability to win the election, especially if the Bloc is able to take some seats in Montreal and actually take some seats from the Liberals. Then I think then we're just seeing, can the Conservatives now run up the score in Ontario? Can they run up the score in BC?
Interesting. Okay, well, let's move on to Ontario, Battleground Ontario. This is sort of where all elections, sadly, are fought and won or lost. It's frustrating for someone like me, grew up in Vancouver. I'm still a Western Canadian, even though I live in Toronto now. But it's always been frustrating that, a small group of sort of the 905 or suburban Ontario determines the entire country. And it looks like it will come down to this once again. So we have quite a few parts of Ontario that we want to focus on. Let's start with Southwest Ontario. David, what should we be looking out for on election night?
I'll be looking at specifically some of the bedroom communities that you're seeing throughout the region. A lot of this has to do with people, like specifically young Canadians, getting pushed out of the urban centers because of real estate prices and whatnot. And when you're talking about cost of living issues, these are things that are front and center of mind for those voters specifically. There's some that are going to be very interesting and I'll be paying attention to specifically. The first is going to be Niagara South. I think that that's a very interesting community. I think next I would be also looking at like Kitchener-Conestoga. So that's even like that makes like a loop around the Kitchener area. And that could be, we've seen a migration of folks, not only from within KW to the more rural parts, but like within Toronto coming that way as well. I would also finally be paying attention to Halton region as well. Down in Milton, we're talking about like again, these younger families that are getting pushed out and priced out of the urban markets. This is one of the first places that they're really going to.
Okay, and then we talked a little bit about the sort of, I guess, I don't know if we call them ethnic ridings anymore, but the ridings that are very heavily based with immigrant communities and, places like Brampton and Mississauga, that it is quite hard to poll and figure out which way this community is leaning. I've seen some estimates that show that the Conservatives could pick up a few seats in Brampton. So Dave, why don't you walk us through that sort of area of the GTA and what you think might happen?
Sure. So the first one I would actually be paying attention to would be Mississauga Lakeshore. This is along the south side of Mississauga, right on the lake, the shore of Lake Ontario. And then it just, Peel region goes up north from there. That's where some of the stronger cultural communities, as you say, like have a very significant influence into how what the election and results are going to be for those individual ridings, and they're going to be quite telling. It's entirely possible that we'll get like we could get 6, 7. We could also get 0. It all depends completely on how those cultural divides really measure out within the actual electorate, which, as you point out, is sometimes quite difficult to measure.
Well, it's different than polling the rest of the country, and it is hard to tell because a lot of it will come down to sort of like the local candidate, the organization that they have on the ground, and maybe different themes than what the general election themes would be. Wyatt, I'll bring you in on this. What do you think about the fact that like some of these ridings in Brampton, Mississauga, when we go out west, we'll talk about Surrey, how these kind of ridings where it's kind of like Sikh or maybe some, I don't know exactly who all the candidates are, but these ethnic communities having such a big influence on the election. Who do you think's run a better campaign in this regard, and who do you think that these communities are going to come out for?
I couldn't say what party is specifically running a better campaign with these ridings because it really depends on the riding. Who did they pick as the candidate? How has the ground game been? Is it somebody who's only acting like a paper candidate? Or like what you saw in the BC provincial election, do you have some of these candidates who are going out there every single day with 60 volunteers and they door knock the thing 4 times over? The funny thing with Brampton and Mississauga, and actually also with the East Asian community in places like Markham, Unionville, and Don Valley North, is that they're almost in a time warp. These ridings have not really been affected by trade war politics nearly as much as what you would consider older white suburban ridings where people, again, watch a lot of legacy media. Because these people don't watch a lot of legacy media. It's a truism, but it is true that many people in the minority community get all their news from YouTube. They get it from online sources. And so we're really seeing a race that probably hasn't been affected by the liberal surge in these suburban areas with a lot of retirees. It's actually going to be its own election completely. I have heard, especially because I've had a lot of experience door knocking in communities with heavy minority representation. And what I found is that while you actually got a lot of older white voters who may have been default conservatives before going liberal, whenever I talk to an Asian household or an Indo household, it's pretty much 8-2 conservative. Out of 10 houses, and this was just a couple days ago, every single Chinese house was voting conservative except for one. It was pretty nuts because, again,
Wow.
they are not reacting to legacy media narratives about how you need to vote liberal because it will make Trump upset and Pierre Poilievre is mini Trump and all that.
That's interesting. Yeah, I remember hearing anecdotes about this back in 2011, that the Chinese people, when you're knocking on doors, Chinese households, like they would just be like, yes, Harper, he's strong, we like him. And it was very much based on the perception of who is a stronger leader. And it's interesting because we know that there's been Chinese election interference in this election. I had Sam Cooper, investigative journalist, on my show several times throughout the campaign talking about this active campaign that was going on with WeChat. This happens basically in Chinese communities. And we know it had an impact in 2021. We know that it prevented Aaron O'Toole from winning a few key seats that maybe could have helped him inch closer to a minority government. So it will be interesting to watch just in regards to whether or not the foreign election interference had an influence, or whether or not this trend is going to maintain, where perhaps more of the people are going to show up for the Conservatives. Let's move on. I know, David, you wanted to talk about York Centre and about York Region. So let's zero in a little bit on 905 in these Toronto area ridings.
Sure. So one of the bigger places to actually watch as well, and this would be likely the first bit of the GTA to actually go conservative before anything else, would be primarily the three of the key ridings in York Region. So we're talking about Newmarket, Aurora, Oak Ridge, Richmond Hill, and Richmond Hill South. You also have the two Vaughns and then the Markhams. The Markhams are very interesting specifically because of that East Asian heritage, specifically Chinese Canadians, and the issue set that they care about is very much so in line with a lot of what Mr. Poilievre's been speaking about, specifically on the Stop the Crime kind of pillar of his entire platform, but also a lot of the drug stuff, because this is something that's very important to this community. So it'll be interesting to see how this actually plays out in those ridings.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, I'm a resident voter of Aurora, Oak Ridge's Richmond Hill, and so my husband and I did our part. We got out early and voted in advance polls. But yes, we will certainly be looking out at that. Okay, anything else in Ontario, David, that we should be keeping our eye out for?
So there's a few. It's interesting with the collapse of or impending collapse of the NDP. There's a few other ridings that become actually quite interesting. So Windsor, Tecumseh, Lakeshore, that's another one where you have like a very strong blue collar union kind of electorate, that when you see a bunch of private sector unions have been endorsing Mr. Poilievre and his campaign, that could also be very interesting. Looking at Hamilton and some of the ridings right around there with the deep manufacturing base that they have, same idea. Traditionally strong union territory, especially with the steel. And this is also where there's a differentiator between Mr. Carney and Mr. Poilievre, is that the tariff response on steel and aluminum, and specifically the pledge by Mr. Poilievre to remove the industrial carbon tax, which actually disproportionately impacts steel specifically. And then lastly, I would actually look up north into Northern Ontario, where we're talking about things like developing the Ring of Fire and further collapse of the Liberals, of the NDP. This actually makes some very interesting races that we haven't seen typically, but the Ring of Fire and everything around it has been such a staple of Mr. Poilievre's speech, and he's also been up there countless times, specifically before the election was called. This is something that he has talked about, the issues that the folks up there really care about, especially on like the union side, the workers' blue collar jobs. This is all stuff that he's been talking about quite deliberately. So making gains up there with some of those seats will actually be very telling.
Interesting. Why do you have any comments on the rest of Ontario there?
Yeah, I was just going to, this is more so a national a comment, but it does have a lot to do with Ontario. When people see that of NDP voters who are going to different parties, that the Liberals are gaining 2/3 of it and the Conservatives tend to be gaining 1/3 of the NDP's vote, they have to remember that the distribution of that on the map is very key when it comes to like vote efficiency. This is what I mean when I say that the Liberals are actually maybe ending up with a less efficient vote than the Conservatives, because the NDP votes that the Liberals are disproportionately eating up are going to be in ridings like Parkdale High Park and University Rosedale and downtown Montreal and stuff like that. Whereas the 1/3 of the NDP vote that the Conservatives are gaining are going to be in these working class suburban areas, and like David's mentioning, up in the Ring of Fire, where you actually might be, the Conservatives are gaining the 1/3 of the NDP that disproportionately matters compared to the 2/3 of downtown progressive activists.
Interesting. Okay, we're gonna talk about the total like overall predictions for the election, but let's go through the prairies in BC. So David, you talked to me about Winnipeg and how some of the ridings in Manitoba are potentially up for grabs that the Conservatives could lose, and then there's a couple of other ones in both Calgary and Edmonton that are going to be tighter than they have been in previous years. So why don't you walk us through those?
Yeah, so there's some of the suburban ridings around Winnipeg that are clearly targets for the Liberals. Thinking about like a Kildone and St. Paul, and also Marty Morance's riding. These are clear targets for the Liberals, and the polling shows that there is strength building among the Liberals in the prairies, and if it's going to be concentrated in any areas, that's where it likely would manifest itself. And then secondly, on the two Alberta major cities, Edmonton Southeast is a very interesting one with Amarjeet Sohi being the Liberal candidate. And then also Edmonton Griesbach, where we have Blake Desjardins as an NDP. He's vulnerable to Kerry Diot, the resident Conservative candidate, the former MP as well. So there's an established brand there as well. And Wyatt, I believe you're from Calgary.
Yes. And so I would say that the two ridings in Calgary that are going to be interesting are, or I would say three. I'll throw three into the mix here. There's technically four, but if the Liberals are going to win any, it's going to be 3 out of the 4 at best. You have Calgary Confederation, you have Calgary Centre, and then you have Calgary Skyview and the McKnight riding. We have had a specific riding poll come out of Main Street Research showing that Skyview is safe for the Conservatives. I'll just assume that's true and assume that it's now McKnight, Centre, and Confederation. Now, I actually think there's a better shot of us losing Confederation and Centre than we have of actually losing McKnight to George Jahal, who defected into that riding because Skyview wasn't as friendly. And I think it's because metropolitan voters in Calgary are disproportionately moving Liberal, so that's where the Liberals are going to benefit in somewhere like Confederation and Centre, who had previously gone Conservative pretty consistently.
Super interesting stuff. Okay, let's move on to British Columbia. David, walk us through what you're watching in BC.
So there's a few NDP seats in the interior specifically, just to start off, that I think are very interesting. Similkameen, South Okanagan, West Kootenay. This is one that could be a very big pickup. And then also Skeena, Bulkley Valley. There's an extremely strong candidate, Ellis Ross, that's going to be running there. Those two, I think, are very interesting. Next, looking at the Lower Mainland and the Metro Van area. First, I would start with Jagmeet Singh's riding. It's looking like he's not going to be returning to Parliament if things manifest themselves as they're currently projected to.
Wow.
And then if we look at other ridings that they're primary liberal conservative duels, thinking specifically of Delta and around that area, that's actually going to be a necessary pickup for the Conservatives for hope for a government. And then lastly, I would also point to the Tri-Cities area, talk about like Coquitlam, Port Coquitlam in that area. This is again another bedroom community where you're seeing a lot of young families that have been priced out of the market of specifically Vancouver. So cost of living issues and such are very front in mind for many of the electorate out there.
Well, why wasn't that the front page headline on all of those newspapers, the legacy media, talking about the fact that Jagmeet Singh is probably very likely going to lose his seat and not be in Parliament? Wouldn't it be interesting if the Liberals win a minority and they need to be propped up by the NDP, but the NDP doesn't have a leader? And it has a small caucus. I mean, it looks like the NDP could end up winning, less than 15 seats? What do you think of that scenario, Wyatt, and what do you think would happen?
Well, this is the perfect question to ask me, because I was actually just having coffee a few days ago with an NDP insider, and they are saying that currently Heather McPherson is not even really focusing on her re-election in, I believe it's Edmonton Strathcona, and she's just preparing to run to replace Jagmeet Singh as the leader. And so, yeah, the NDP is not going to be becoming more moderate over time, which means that if the Liberals do win a minority government and you have Heather pro-Hamas McPherson as the leader, it's going to get very uncomfortable trying to work with the NDP if they cannot get the Bloc Québécois on side. And frankly, it would be very foolish for the Bloc to work with for the Liberals again, because they would be basically saying, why even bother voting Bloc when you could have just voted Liberal and gotten a clear majority government?
Wow. So, I mean, if that happens, I feel like the odds of another election coming very soon are probably quite high. David, I know you don't want to make a prediction, but what's your best estimate in a projection? We had our poll come out on Tuesday or Wednesday, based on the polls in the field on Tuesday. We had it at 39-39. Just a reminder, folks, in 2011, when Stephen Harper won his massive majority government, he had 39% of the vote. So here we have a scenario where Pierre Poilievre could come in as high as Stephen Harper did when he got that massive majority, not win the election. I don't think that's going to happen. I'm still optimistic. I still think that Pierre Poilievre could win. My prediction would be a conservative minority. But David, where are you thinking things are going to land?
I think it's going to be a minority of some sort, whether it's liberal or conservative. The question becomes how much support, especially if it's a liberal minority, how much support in the House of Commons can the NDP give them with guarantees and things like that? Because if the gap is bigger and they require more seats than the NDP caucus has, there's a significantly stronger chance that we could be in election in the next 6 months and be here doing this all over again, because the Bloc would be a very interesting dance partner in Parliament specifically. So you also have very fundamentally competing visions for Quebec's place in Canada. So we're talking about a party that is very much at odds at like the core spiritual level of its existence, potentially being forced to work with them. And so that would, if that is the case, then that would be a very fragile relationship at least to start. My guess would be at that point, we would be back at the polls within between 6 to 9 months.
Wow, wouldn't that be interesting? Well, Wyatt, you had a prediction on your YouTube channel, and someone sent it to me. They were commenting on my YouTube channel in the comments saying that Wyatt says that there's a chance that the Conservatives could actually lose a popular vote, that Carney could get 39, Poilievre could get 38, but because of the math, Poilievre could still win. So why don't you walk us through that scenario? And is that your prediction?
It's not my prediction. I would say I'm kind of like David. It's going to be a minority government of some description. I would say that if it's the neighbor poll that we assume is going to be accurate, I think it's going to be a conservative minority. If it's the other polls saying, with like the other pollsters saying that the liberals are up by a few, it's going to be a liberal minority. If it's somewhere in between, I think the conservatives eke out a minority that kind of looks like those projections that I was showing. Because if you go on to the website 338 Canada, you can pull up their election simulator, and maybe it's not entirely accurate, but they show if the bloc can actually perform at 6.5%, 7% nationally, all that obviously being concentrated Quebec, and they block the Liberals from being able to pick up a lot of seats in Quebec, and then the Conservatives generally have a decent performance everywhere else, pick up a few seats in Atlantic Canada, pick up a bunch in Ontario and BC. I think that the path to victory could actually have the Conservatives win while actually dropping the popular vote to the Liberals. Because again, the problem with the Liberals is they are picking up votes in ridings that they can't win or ridings they were already going to win anyway. So they're going from winning 50% victories in places like Montreal and Toronto and downtown Vancouver to winning overwhelming victories from 50% to sometimes up to 75%. And again, that's where the NDP working class vote comes into play. Are the Liberals winning most of the NDP defectors? Sure. But if they're winning them in Spadina, Fort York, and they're winning them in University Rosedale, it doesn't really matter. You want the voters who are actually in the ridings that can swing, and that looks like what the third of NDP voters that the Conservatives are winning are going to be.
Really interesting stuff. Well, thank you so much for your time. David Murray, our in-house pollster at Juno News, is with One Persuasion. Wyatt Claypool, who is a political commentator, and he runs his own YouTube channel. You should go subscribe, The National Telegraph. Thank you so much. We're looking forward to Monday evening, and we'll talk to you then.
Take care.
Okay, thanks so much. That's all the time we have for today. I'm Candice Malcolm. This is the Candice Malcolm Show. Thank you, and God bless.